In August 1979, a British woman in Gateshead was laying in bed in the wee hours of the morning. It was a tough night for the woman as her husband was away working the graveyard shift and she had terrible tooth pain. While her night was bad, it was about to get much worse. In this episode, we will examine this very strange UFO sighting and the alien encounters experienced by this British woman. In August 1979, as the young woman laid in bed, trying to fall asleep, she decided to sit up in bed and drink some tea to soothe her tooth pain. As she was sipping her tea, she would notice a faint red light coming through the curtains. The red light began getting brighter and more prominent. This prompted the woman, who used the pseudonym of Carol for the report, to rush to the window. There, she would be stunned to see a disc-shaped craft hovering over her street. The object was multicolored, floating silently. Carol would then watch the craft shoot off quickly into the distance and disappear. The event frightened Carol, but she managed to crawl back into bed. However, Carol wouldn't be going to sleep anytime soon. Moments after she got into bed, a tiny UFO flew in through the window. It was around 18 inches in circumference, and oddly, a trail of something that resembled glitter trailed it. The tiny UFO wasn't silent and was buzzing loudly over the bed. After a few minutes, the craft flew through the bedroom door and vanished. Around 2 weeks later, the tiny craft would visit Carol once again. As Carol was putting her daughter in bed, the craft flew in the house. Once again it buzzed, and Carol screamed for her husband. Right as she yelled, the craft took off, and her husband never saw it. The visits by this tiny craft had surely frightened Carol, but things were about to get much more frightening. The next time Carol's husband went to work the graveyard shift, she decided to take the children and go to her mother's home. That night, Carol woke up around 4 a.m. paralyzed and would be horrified to see the tiny craft had followed her to her mother's home. The object was buzzing over the bed once again, and to Carol's horror, the craft hadn't come alone. There were around 12 small beings in the room. The entities were around 2 feet tall, wearing white suits, and seemed to have fake hair, similar to a doll. They walked around her bed, and a paralyzed Carol could only look on in horror. The beings seemed to communicate with one another through clicking sounds. The beings examined Carol while she laid there helpless. For the next 2 months, Carol continued to have these types of experiences. A tiny UFO entered the room along with tiny humanoids. One interesting aspect of this case is that Carol's dog barked furiously each time the small craft entered the room. The behavior of the dog seems to suggest that Carol probably wasn't dreaming the experience, as the dog would often knock things over and others in her home would complain of the barking the next day. In addition, people who slept around Carol too would report hearing the strange humming sound from her bedroom. While it's not clear exactly what the entities did to her and why, we do know these visitations did stop after about 2 months, letting Carol finally get the rest she needed. What can we make of this strange encounter and these tiny UFO visitations? There's several interesting aspects to it. First is the size of the UFO. Tiny UFOs are not what people typically think of with UFOs, but it's important to point out that these are not unheard of. A classic and famous case of this occurred in Kaki City in Japan in August 1972. Then, Michio Seo, a 13-year-old boy, was on his way home from school when he spotted a tiny metallic object hovering over a rice field. He would go, grab his friends, and the group would have several encounters with it. They even managed to capture it, photograph it, but the tiny object vanished without a trace. We covered this incredible story on a prior episode of the Street of Silence. Tiny UFOs raise lots of questions surrounding the UFO phenomena. For example, how many of these UFOs have came and been undetected? It's certainly possible that one could fly down and camouflage itself, hiding much easier than a bigger craft. These tiny UFOs could present more opportunities to gather information than having a regular-sized ship. Did this event occur, though? It's definitely not a case with overwhelming evidence, but it appears that unless the woman fabricated the story, these events might have occurred. While it could have been a dream, the noises reported by others seem to suggest that Carol did experience these events. Still, since she remained anonymous and has no type of physical proof, skeptics will certainly not take the case seriously. Despite this, the case doesn't have any elements or red flags that immediately lead us to believe it was faked. Still, like many UFO sightings and alien encounters, the majority of the evidence lies in the witness and her testimony.